The form taken by the socialist system varies considerably. Historically, there have been different types of socialism. For simplicity, today we will consider basically four main types of socialism. The first is so-called real socialism, that of Soviet-type economies. Nowadays, this socialist system is rather on the decline. In the past, it was present in a large part of the world, but today only a few strongholds remain. Specifically, we could mention North Korea. Also in Asia, there is Vietnam, and a few more or less important parts of communist China. And there is Cuba, and that is about it. However, this is relatively recent, because up to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the socialism of Soviet-type economies was very widespread. This is perhaps the most profound socialism. It is also called real socialism. Typically, systematic coercion affects the broadest spheres of the economy, and does so to a very great degree, to the extent that this socialism is characterized by what is known as the public ownership of the means of production. In other words, all factors of production, all economic goods of higher order, which are the goods used in action processes, and, remember, combined with other complementary factors, so that, after a process that takes time, they will mature in the form of consumer goods and services. All of the prior intermediate stages are publicly owned. To put it more directly, institutional coercion extends to all processes of production. Thus, all private entrepreneurial processes are forbidden. All productive factors, all industries, land, capital goods, and so on are publicly owned. Hence, there is no stock market, where securities that represent partial ownership are freely exchanged. No, that is real socialism. It is the profoundest type of socialism. To justify it, and to make it attractive, its proponents always cite the loftiest aims. The reasons for real socialism are always pompous. Real socialists passionately defend, for instance, freeing humanity from its chains and achieving equality of results, which is considered the quintessential ideal of justice. Socialism or death is one of the slogans we read in big letters whenever there is a demonstration in Cuba. It is an incredible tragedy that millions and millions of people have died due to attempts to achieve this ideal, and many have acted in good faith, believing they were doing the best thing. What is more, these ideas have filtered into other areas, even into the religious sphere. For example, that is the case of liberation theology. It would be of great interest to carry out a detailed study of the main characteristics of the real socialist system, how it functioned, and the problems it had in the former Soviet Union. Certainly, real socialism is currently in steep decline. Now, let us move on to the second type of socialism. This is the socialism closest to us, and it is viewed as a lighter version. I am talking about democratic socialism, or the famous social democracy. This is the most popular kind of socialism nowadays. Historically, in the 20th century, following World War II, mainly in Germany, it emerged as a tactical departure from real socialism. As a first step, real socialists accepted democratic procedures, and thus democratic socialism appeared. We will gain power to impose this ideal of socializing production goods, but we will act democratically. We will not use revolutionary procedures, shots in the back of the head, the dictatorship of the proletariat, a coup like the one Lenin staged. Instead, we will accept democratic procedures. Then, as a second step, it was accepted that there would be no widespread public ownership of the means of production, but that state intervention would be aimed at establishing what is known as a welfare state, or a progressive tax system that redistributes income. And all of this would take place in a framework of tight economic regulation. Well, this reform, in which Marxist or Soviet socialism was somehow gradually softened and became democratic, and it was accepted that there would be a market framework and private ownership of the means of production. But in a context of strong government intervention and coercion, with a welfare state, high taxes and so on, is what characterizes social democracy. Now, from the standpoint of economic theory, the important thing is that we grasp the following idea very clearly. The existence or lack of democratic elections has no bearing whatsoever on the basic theoretical problem of ineradicable ignorance, which afflicts every governing body in charge of exercising institutional coercion. To put it another way, to the extent that a social democratic government continues to exercise institutional coercion, this will be followed by all of the effects of discoordination, maladjustment, chaos, etc., that we have studied together in this course. Such effects will appear precisely in the areas in which institutional coercion has an impact, and to the degree of its impact. If in a number of areas coercion exerts less influence and there is more liberty, then the system will be able to prosper to that extent. But in all areas of intervention, institutional coercion, income redistribution, the welfare state, the social security monopoly, labor legislation, and so on, we are going to witness all of the effects of maladjustment, discoordination, violence, chaos, and damage that results. So the existence of a series of democratically elected representatives is irrelevant. Do not be fooled into thinking that just because representatives have been democratically elected, they already possess, by some miracle, the practical, dispersed, exclusive and constantly and dynamically changing knowledge which entrepreneurs generate when they have to detect difficulties and solve them in the course of their activities. There is always that acute problem of a lack of knowledge and communication. Therefore, the alibi, so to speak, of the democratic ideal is highly dangerous, because people generally believe that if representatives have been democratically elected, then unlimited political power is harmless. What do I care if power is unlimited or anything can be achieved or imposed by force? The representatives have been democratically elected, so we have a sort of guarantee that the decisions imposed at any particular time will be those of the majority. Actually, Hayek writes that if democracy is interpreted to mean the absolute power of the majority, and that is the literal etymological meaning, demos kratos, demos, the people, kratos, absolute power, Hayek writes, if democracy is taken to mean government by the unrestricted will of the majority, I am not a democrat, and even regard such government as pernicious, since the majority exploits the minority, and in the long run, unworkable. That is, it cannot be put into practice. Due to the problem of ineradicable ignorance, even if authorities are ultimately elected according to the will of the majority at any particular time, the commands they impose on society will not contain the first-hand information necessary to organize society. It is a tyrannical system, and it will disrupt society. Therefore, together we will see the disastrous effects of the so-called welfare state, and we will consider a paradox. In recent years, social democratic governments, particularly Germany, in the years up to the arrival of Angela Merkel, have systematically drawn back from much of what they had done in the welfare state. They have reduced benefits. They have cut taxes. People have all tightened their belts. Markets have been liberalized, and so on. Precisely for that reason, economically speaking, Germany is now in a relatively less unsettled state with respect to the rest of the countries in Europe. That is why, according to Hayek, we should talk about demarchy, which would be demos, the people, arcane, to rule. So the people would rule, but, take note, in an isonomy. They would all be subject to general legal principles or rules, substantive laws. That way, the majority would not exploit the minority. So there would be few laws. They would be substantive in nature, and everyone would have to comply with them. Now we come to a third type of socialism, conservative or right-wing socialism. Here the intention is also to impose a particular social model by force, based on coercive commands. However, the goal is to maintain a certain status quo, that is, a certain way of organizing society. Whether it be the caste system in India, a particular redistribution of income, or a certain paternalistic framework. Papa State knows better than we do what we want, and therefore he imposes it on us by force. Another typical manifestation of right-wing socialism is a hierarchically organized society in which the most important values are those associated with the military. That is military socialism. Whether what matters is military status, social status, religious status, a particular redistribution of income, or a caste system, what characterizes conservative or right-wing socialism is paternalism, and the forceful imposition of a pre-established system considered just and good. Also, there is a reluctance towards social changes. The desire is to maintain what exists and avoid changes. There are other manifestations of right-wing socialism. For instance, there is guild socialism, in which different guilds provide the foundation for the social structure to be imposed by force. There is also agrarian socialism, and we should take its influence into account. Curiously, when the European Union was created, agrarian socialism carried tremendous weight. In fact, this explains the fact that, to this day, perhaps the most significant part of the European Union budget still corresponds to the common agricultural policy. Why all of these subsidies? Later we will see the harmful effects they have. Well, the theory was that we needed to provide rural communities, not only because many people lived in the country and they could vote, but also based on an idyllic view of country life. There was a desire to avoid the depopulation of rural areas and to care for the countryside, so that it would remain as we were used to seeing it. Thus, reactionary or right-wing socialism, which seeks to preserve the status quo, takes quite a variety of forms, and it can focus on the military, agriculture, guilds, and so on. There are few differences between left-wing and right-wing parties. Everyone seeks to gain power in order to impose their own standards by force, and citizens are always bewildered and believe that first, all of the evil they see in the world around them is the fault of the current political authority, and second, that the evil would be solved if only they removed him from office and replaced him with their own candidate. So politics are viewed as if they were a soccer game, Real Madrid against Barca. No? Today Barca is in power, but we are hoping that now the supporters of Real Madrid will win, and then we will all be happy. We will all go out into the street and blow our whistles and celebrate. But harsh reality sets in. Any attempt to impose a model by force is doomed to fail. It is not a question of removing the bad guys and replacing them with the good guys. We are dealing with a purely scientific problem. It is impossible to organize society from above. I do not care if you find the best person you can imagine, someone endowed with the greatest scientific and technical knowledge, and with the most humane values. If you put him or her in charge of a government to coercively organize the world according to benevolent criteria, you will turn the world into hell. Not because the people in charge are bad, but because it is impossible to organize a process of social cooperation that is comprised of billions of human beings like you and me, each of us endowed with an innate capacity for entrepreneurship. The fourth type of socialism we will discuss is scientistic socialism, social engineering. This is a particularly perverse type of socialism. It is the type supported or defended by intellectuals, all of those who in general believe themselves to be smarter than their fellow human beings, because they have studied for more years, because they know more, because they are more cultured, because they are more refined. They consider themselves superior, and therefore with spectacular arrogance, they believe they are entitled to design the lives of all ordinary citizens. Scientistic socialism is extremely dangerous, because ultimately, as Hayek explains in his book titled, for that very reason, The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism, the gravest sin human beings in general, and scientists in particular, can commit is the sin of pride, of intellectual conceit, of believing we are so smart that we can do whatever we want with society. And this temptation is unusually strong for intellectuals, for my colleagues, for those of us who study, for those of us who devote our lives to analysis, research, and science. Therefore, though it is sad to say it, we must be perpetually on our guard against scientists. It is not at all uncommon to find a dictator behind an apparently benevolent scientist who has made great contributions to humanity, and this is something you can see throughout the history of thought, beginning with the ancient Greece of the first philosophers. Consider Plato. His ideal was Sparta, the militaristic society organized from above. He looked down on entrepreneurs, craftsmen and merchants. What does Plato say? He speaks of a militaristic, communistic society, in which all resources are made available to everyone, and in which the family does not exist. Who needs the bourgeois family? Instead, the women are available to all the men. There is a pool of women, and every day each man goes to the one he wants, and then the children arrive. And fortunately, Plato reasons, there are no family relationships or loyalty, no mom and dad, and the children are sons and daughters of the state. Incidentally, if anyone is born crippled or disabled, or will not conceivably be able to serve in the army, not strong for instance, he is thrown over a cliff and killed, and then there is one less mouth to feed. And that is a system perfectly and rationally devised by the philosopher king. That is, the smartest and most intelligent person, the scientist. And who is that? Well, Plato, of course. He says, yes, it is me. I am the one who designs and defines the ideal and imposes it by force. Who is more entitled than I, the smartest person, to organize society from above? And Sparta was based on such a model. Do not be surprised. For example, who saw the movie 300? It is based on a comic book. Do you remember the movie? Well, notice the subliminal message it sends. Who are the good guys? Who are the ones that save Greece? Well, the 300 Spartans, of course. And what do they look like? They are portrayed as muscular. And when they are on their way to Thermopylae, in the mountain pass, they come face to face with the Athenian soldiers. How does the movie depict the Athenian soldiers? Like morons. You there, what is your profession? I'm a potter, sir. And you, what is your profession? Sculptor, sir. Sculptor. Ha! They are shown as little less than idiots. And who does the movie compare them with? 300 strong and confident soldiers. The message is, these are the ones who will save Greece. So Sparta is the ideal, and entrepreneurial, commercial Athens, which is relatively more oriented toward the free market and democracy, is belittled and dismissed. Well, the presentation of the movie corresponds exactly with the intellectual model of the great philosophers who have gone down in history. Socrates, for instance, was tremendously arrogant, and of course he was corrupting the young people of his time. There is no doubt about it. The corruption consisted of saying to them, do not follow in the footsteps of your parents. So, your father wants you to carry on the wax candle or flute business? No, do not do that. Instead, come with me and seek virtue. These philosophers never understood the spontaneous market order, which made it possible for Athens to prosper in a commercial environment throughout the Mediterranean, and to create such wealth that, among other things, people like Socrates were able to live without lifting a finger. One of Socrates' main disciples was Plato. What a scoundrel! Read his contributions. And Aristotle, who fell between two stools, was not trustworthy either. To begin with, what was Aristotle? He was the private tutor to the son of the greatest tyrant of his time, Philip of Macedon, who did away with the climate of liberty in the Greek city-states. Furthermore, Aristotle's pupil was insane, a madman, a dictator, and a tyrant. Alexander the Great, another scoundrel. It is true that Aristotle defended private property without much conviction, but he failed to understand the spontaneous market order. According to Aristotle, a city-state with over 100,000 inhabitants would be unworkable, because it would be impossible to organize from above. He did not grasp the spontaneous market order. So the first philosophers, many of whom were geniuses in the area of epistemology and so on, did not understand even the rudiments of the spontaneous market order. Their adversaries understood it much better. The much reviled sophists had a much better understanding of that spontaneous order, as did some other philosophers like Xenophon, but the best-known philosophers missed it. The fact is, the scientistic conceit that fuels the social engineering type of socialism is as old as the development of human thought. In modern times, this conceit takes the form of what is known as Cartesian rationalism. or constructivist rationalism, which is the idea that human reason is capable of anything. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this is the French Revolution. Religious images in churches were destroyed and replaced with the goddess of reason. Human reason was deified. Nowadays, we place so much trust in human reason that we believe science holds the answer to all of our problems. We think technology, engineering, and the advancements made in the natural sciences can be applied to the social sphere, and that with this approach and a series of formulas, we can develop a social engineering plan that will permit us to organize society efficiently and more justly. What is the crucial error of social engineering? It is simply the assumption that the practical, dispersed information, which human beings are constantly generating as they act, can be created in a context of coercion and then transmitted to a machine, a supercomputer, or to a committee of experts who would then digest, analyze, and structure it and be able to scientifically and far more efficiently organize society and achieve any goal. Scientistic socialism is particularly dangerous. First, due to the temptation scientists succumb to when we think we are smarter than everyone else. And second, because we think we are entitled to impose on the rest of society what we believe is correct. So people are told they must or must not smoke, and that what they must do is going to be imposed on them by force. They are told whether or not to take drugs and drink alcohol, and at what times. Do not do this because it is not good for you. We need only switch on or listen to any news program. There is always the same format. A certain problem has been detected and is due to people's stupidity. But never fear, this agency or committee or government department is on the job. And with tax money, we will inform, educate and teach people. And if that is not enough, we will impose a solution by force. This rationalism that deifies reason is in error. Furthermore, it fuels all the other types of socialism. Curiously, any dictator, whether Hitler, Stalin, or anyone else you can think of, has invariably had an entourage of scientists and intellectuals who have justified his actions and sucked up to him. Always. Dictators have always found scientific justifications and social engineering for the atrocities they have committed. Even very firmly established scientists who have done an immense service to humanity, like Einstein, have provided support. If you read Einstein's remarks on economic and political topics, you will see that they are truly pitiful. He knew nothing about economics. He was an expert on quantum physics, mathematics, and the theory of relativity, but he knew absolutely nothing about the spontaneous market order and how society works. On page 82 of my book, Socialism, Economic Calculation and Entrepreneurship, you will find a list of the 5 errors of the social engineer. This is an important section. Please take the time to analyze the list carefully. I'm not going to cover it here, but when I ask you about it later, please be prepared to answer. Now we come to a hodgepodge, otherwise we could go on forever, of other types of socialism that have emerged in the real world. For instance, Christian or solidarity-based socialism. Well, many people of good faith, or who are religious and belong to any of the Christian denominations, pursue the ideal of the salvation of the human race and eternal life, and seek to achieve it in advance here on earth. Why not? And they seek to advance this ideal or objective by force, which is the essential characteristic of socialism. We read in the Gospels that the first Christians lived by communist principles. They shared everything and distributed things according to need. That is true, but they did so voluntarily, not because anyone imposed it on them from above. So if someone voluntarily decides to set up a commune and gets people to voluntarily sign up for that life, then there is no problem. That would be part of the market economy. The problem arises when the attempt is made to impose such a life by force. Then we say, it is justified. We will develop a liberation theology. But what does liberation mean here? It means we are going to justify guerrilla warfare. It means machine guns, guerrilla fighters, and terrorists to impose the ideal by force, like in the Civil War in El Salvador, for instance. There are good guys and bad guys, and I am here with my gun to kill the landowner and take his land. because what he has done is unjust. Well, let us analyze the property rights in the case and see if they are legitimate, and we will do so objectively, in a civilized manner, in the courts of justice, and the truth will be clear. But let us not call for a revolution, the worst atrocities conceivable, the use of physical violence and systematic coercion, and justify it all perhaps in the name of Jesus Christ. That is what Christian, solidarity-based socialism or liberation theology encourages. A true heresy. There is also syndicalist socialism. It involves the attempt to forcibly impose a system in which companies are owned by the workers who run them. This type of socialism is especially perverse and chaotic. One person may work at a wealthy company with lots of capital and receive a very large share in the distribution of income. Another may work at a dairy with 4 cows and receive very little. And why should some people receive more than others? Where this kind of unionization occurs, barriers are immediately established. Hey, no one else can join my cooperative, because if more people join, I will get a smaller piece of the pie. Syndicalist socialism was attempted in the former communist Yugoslavia, and it was a dismal failure. Even the few coordinating links that remained by command in Soviet Russia disappeared, and the chaos was indescribable. Now we will wrap up this section with some remarks about the evolution of the concept of socialism. By socialism, people have traditionally understood real socialism as I have defined it, namely, a system based on the public ownership of the means of production. In fact, that is the definition Mises uses in his now classic work, Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analysis, in which he criticizes socialism. The first edition appeared in German in 1922, followed by the second edition 10 years later. Does this mean Mises was wrong? No. During the first third of the 20th century, when people discussed socialism, it was always understood that they meant real socialism, of Marxist or Soviet origin. Nevertheless, this definition, a system based on the public ownership of the means of production, is misleading. It does not say based on coercion and shots in the back of the head, but that is what the public ownership of production goods amounts to. It means private property is forbidden, and therefore so are voluntary exchanges and the free exercise of entrepreneurship. Everything is organized from above, based on coercive commands. In other words, as Lenin wrote, the whole economy is organized on the lines of the postal service, and the police forcibly imposed this system. Well, it immediately became clear that, in terms of science, this definition, public ownership of the means of production, was unsatisfactory. First, it is a static definition. The existence of socialism will depend on whether or not the means of production are publicly owned. And second, to determine whether or not socialism exists, we must first understand the legal category of private and public ownership, and the economic category of means of production. Thus, we need to throw open the windows and let in the fresh air of the dynamic, subjectivist view of the market. The important thing is not to determine whether or not public ownership applies to a certain economic category, the means of production, but rather to clearly identify the essence of socialism. And in dynamic terms, the essence of socialism is coercion. Coercion is a human action which consists of forcing others to do what I want them to do, instead of what they want to do. It involves imposing my plan on them by force, which, as you know, means physical violence or a threat of physical violence. In the 1980s, a very important development occurred in the definition and conception of socialism, and we owe this new perspective mainly to Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hoppe wrote a book titled A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, which was a significant step forward in the conception of socialism. Hoppe does not define socialism in terms of whether or not the means of production are publicly owned, and instead he focuses on coercion. He defines socialism as any system of institutional aggression or coercion against property rights. The deciding factor is no longer the public ownership of the means of production, but institutional coercion against property rights. This is a giant step forward, because now the definition is dynamic. Either there is coercion against property rights, or there is not. However, Though this definition constituted an important development, it did not seem to me to be perfect. I felt there was still something missing. I turned it over and over in my mind, and I remember walking on the beach in Mallorca one day, when the entrepreneurial light bulb went on for me, and I was able to see clearly what was missing from the definition. The problem is not detecting whether or not there is coercion against private property, or property rights, for that requires us to first agree on what property rights are, and on what just property rights are. A legal institution is preceded by the spontaneous process of human interaction. So, ultimately, what is the coercion against? The coercion or violence is against the human action of other human beings, which is expressed mainly in their capacity for creativity and entrepreneurial coordination. I am talking about the exercise of entrepreneurship, from in emprehendo, prehendi, prehensum, which means to discover, to see, to recognize the opportunities that arise in one's environment, and to act accordingly to take advantage of them. Entrepreneurship somehow embodies the very essence of what it is to be human, the basic nature of man, what naturally most characterizes us, our capacity to act entrepreneurially. Therefore, we must focus on whether or not an institutionally organized system of coercion against our human action exists. So, in a way, I took the final step, and beginning with the first Spanish edition of my book, Socialism, Economic Calculation and Entrepreneurship, the one you have, which was published in 1992, I completed the definition of socialism, defining it in a general way as any system of institutional aggression against the free exercise of entrepreneurship. It is true that through the spontaneous order, entrepreneurial human interaction gives rise to a series of patterned behaviors from which the law, and specifically property law, emerges. There is no doubt about it. But entrepreneurial human action precedes the law, and in that sense, coercion precedes, or can precede, the legal materialization of human entrepreneurship. That is how I arrived at the definition we have used in class. Socialism should be understood as any system of institutional aggression against the origin of the evolutionary process which gives rise to property law, and this origin is human interaction, or entrepreneurship. Rather than define socialism as Hopper does, coercion against the evolutionary result of the process, property law, I define socialism as coercion against human action itself, or entrepreneurship itself, which embodies the quintessential nature of human beings. This is the most dynamic definition. Functionally speaking, it is the most effective, because it is the most general. It is a general, and thus very strong definition, and it has a number of advantages. It permits us to adopt the same approach to real, comprehensive, all-embracing socialism, to the halfway socialism of social democracy, to what is known as piecemeal social engineering, which involves trial and error, and to interventionism. Any coercive measures, whether a partial one that affects a specific sphere, a more or less thorough one, or a more or less totally comprehensive one, insofar as it influences society in the sphere in which it has an impact, and precisely to the extent that it is effective, will produce all of socialism's typical effects, which we have studied together in past classes. This approach offers a solution to a problem Mises had. Mises considered socialism to be one thing and interventionism to be another, and he studied them separately. But with our broad definition of socialism, we can deal in the same way with all types of state or systematic intervention in society. From a scientific and functional standpoint, that is the great advantage of the definition of socialism I am proposing. We will conclude this topic with a couple of considerations. The first has to do with the inanity of the idyllic concepts of socialism. I am sure you have noticed that ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, socialists have lost their banner, and they are totally disoriented. They supported an ideal which they saw embodied in Soviet-type economies. Almost half of the world's population was subjected to such regimes. The Cold War erupted between the powers espousing the two systems, the market economy versus the socialist system. Granted, the market economy left much to be desired. There was plenty of government interference, etc. But the difference was clear. When the Berlin Wall crumbled and socialism disappeared, socialists and progressives lost their point of reference. Now they must look for another banner under which to somehow justify state interventionism and continue defining themselves as socialist. So all kinds of idyllic definitions and conceptualizations of socialism emerged. The meaning of the word socialism became vague. For instance, socialism was defined as social harmony, the harmonious union of man with nature, or the maximization of social welfare, or it amounted to do-goodism. In other words, socialism is whatever is good. Equality, for example. But hold on a minute. That is well and good, but this ideal you are defending, what form will it take? What specific measures will be adopted? And do you believe that because your ideal is so lofty, its forcible imposition from above on everyone is justified? Yes or no? Clarify that, whether coercion is involved or not. First, clear up your mental confusion. Decide what your intentions are. And second, do you wish to impose them by force? This way, we will find out in each case whether we are encountering mental confusion, simple, crude opportunism, or, as is more common, an attempt to conceal, under an attractive veneer, the institutional aggression someone wishes to continue exercising. What did the rallying cry used to be? The attainment of real socialism. What is the rallying cry now? Stopping global warming. That justifies anything. It justifies taxes, restrictions on what you can consume, the prohibition of eating cows. It is a new banner to be imposed by force. For if it is not imposed by force, and everything is voluntary, there is no socialism problem. Socialism is characterized by coercion. Always inquire whether or not coercion is ultimately involved. Find out whether or not an ideal is to be imposed using the power of the state. The second of our considerations is the following question. Could the term socialism someday be restored? If you visit the countries of Eastern Europe and you mention socialism, you will find it to be the most corrupted term, with the most derogatory connotation. Nobody wants to hear a single word about socialism. For generations, people there have been sold the socialist ideal, and you cannot imagine what they have suffered. In the West, because we have suffered less, we allow ourselves to be manipulated more. But someday, will it be possible to restore the term socialism, so that an honest person, someone who understands the spontaneous process and knows that it drives society and civilization and fosters harmony, could conceivably be defined as a socialist? What system am I referring to? Clearly, capitalism, the market economy, and the spontaneous order of social cooperation. Only if this semantic change occurs, and one day by socialism we begin to understand an order based on the private ownership of the means of production, voluntary exchanges, the spontaneous market order, etc., that is, only if socialism comes to mean what nowadays is considered even the opposite of socialism, will it be possible to restore the term. Otherwise, it is doomed to disguise wicked content with a weasel word, an attractive shell. Weasels are able to make a tiny hole in an egg, suck out everything inside, and leave the shell intact. So, a weasel word is a word whose meaning has been totally prostituted. For example, the term democracy. The meaning has been sucked out and replaced with content that is the exact opposite, and the packaging has been kept in order to fool people. In any case, though we do not know if this process of semantic development will take place or not, in recent writings I have begun to try to stimulate it. Therefore, I have been talking less and less about socialism because it is misleading. Many people think I am referring to political notions, and I consider Rajoy as socialist as Zapatero. Furthermore, as a scientist, I must try to encourage people's understanding of the world to evolve toward the scientific truth as I see it. Thus, I am speaking less and less of socialism and more of statism. In fact, statism, to the extent that it embodies the coercive and systematic exercise of violence, is what produces all of the negative effects we have studied with respect to socialism. We will see if I am successful, and future events unfold in this direction, and in these same classes 10 or 15 years from now, all of my analysis has to do with statism. Perhaps, instead of socialism, economic calculation and entrepreneurship, the book will be titled Statism, Economic Calculation and Entrepreneurship. Ultimately, the state's embodiment of systematic violence is what causes all of the negative effects we are studying. That is what sparked my evolution toward anarchy. That is, the process of social cooperation in which no agency holds a monopoly on violence in a particular territory, but rather there is a system of private agencies, and human beings voluntarily subscribe to their services by paying a certain monthly fee. Each agency backs a legal system and offers different levels of degrees of public order. Though the agencies are different, they are coordinated, thanks to a number of voluntary rules, like those followed in the IATA to reach agreement on certain security protocols in different airlines. Well, the same approach would be taken to prevent, stop and punish crime. You can be sure that a private system of this sort would be much more efficient at maintaining public order and respecting human life and property than the system we have now, based on an agency that holds a monopoly on public order, and is therefore dogged by all the bureaucratic problems of ineradicable ignorance we now face, with public police forces, government judicial systems, and so on. And these observations about public order are also applicable to every other sphere. The monetary sphere, that of central banking, social security, the welfare state, etc. And this is the area in which professors and economists on the cutting edge are working today, well into the second decade of the 21st century. We are working out how a stateless society would be organized. By state, we understand an agency that holds a monopoly on violence in a certain geographical area. We are studying the possible workings of a system based on the spontaneous order, in which there would be private companies that would back different competing frameworks of law and justice. I will leave you with just this sketch of such a system. If any of you are interested, I can give you information on the most recent literature, the various articles and books. In Spanish, we have published Justicia sin Estado, The Enterprise of Law, Justice Without the State, by Professor Bruce Benson of Florida State University. The publisher is Union Editorial, in case any of you would like to write a paper on the book. Also included are a number of delightful historical studies, which show that private justice systems have worked very well in many historical contexts. You can also read the writings of Bruno Frey, a professor at the University of Basel. Frey developed the concept of functional, overlapping, and competing jurisdictions. In other words, security and defense providers like Prosegur and Securitas would each offer different levels of public order in accordance with a certain legal code. In some jurisdictions, abortion would be a crime. In others, it would not be a crime. Each person would pay the provider he or she chose, and there would be no obligation to sign up with any. We are also studying and analyzing what would happen if somebody stole a TV set from a client of another agency, and how mobsters would be dealt with. All of that is being analyzed. Certainly there would be a lot fewer mobsters than there are today. A lack of information makes the state highly inefficient. And do you think that in a private market process, a mafia would last for 30 or 40 years? That is the height of inefficiency. No. A private sector would put an end to mafias much more quickly, efficiently, economically, and justly, which is what matters most. In the final part of the course, we are going to focus less on abstractions and more on concrete reality. Well, for better or for worse, we live in Spain, in the European Union, in the 21st century, and we live in a society that is neither a pure market economy nor a system of real socialism. European societies are mixed economies. They are what we call interventionist systems. We will define interventionism, consider its effects, and apply the theoretical knowledge we have covered together in this course to the most important and significant cases of interventionism. We will look carefully at them. As a sample, I have chosen the most significant interventionist measures. We will apply what we have learned in such a way that, mutatis mutandis, you will be able to easily apply the same conceptual framework to any other interventionist measure you wish to analyze. Well, in human action, Mises begins by examining what interventionism is. As you already know, he stresses the difference between interventionism and socialism. But from my point of view, as I have just explained, they are simply two similar manifestations in society, though they differ in degree of impact and severity. According to Mises, interventionism is characterized by the existence of a market. In other words, with such a system, voluntary exchanges are possible within a relatively large sphere. There are entrepreneurs. We are able to exercise entrepreneurship to a certain extent in those areas, though with varying degrees of liberty. There is private property. We can own our apartments and our cars. The sphere of private property is relatively large. Nevertheless, the state does not limit itself to properly defining and defending property rights. Instead, it takes on a number of much broader functions, and these are extremely intrusive and far-reaching. The state interferes in practically all aspects of commercial life. You are studying for a degree in business administration and management, and when you start working and join a company, you will see that a huge amount of your time will go not toward trying to produce, as efficiently and economically as possible, the goods and services your customers want, but to trying to comply with provisions, regulations, orders, administrative commands, and bureaucratic red tape, or attempting to deal with them in such a way that they affect you as little as possible. I repeat, the state interferes constantly with commercial activity in a great many areas, via commands and prohibitions. The state expropriates half of our income. That is to say, we work for the state until practically July. And there is a process that later gives rise to a series of goods and services which the state does a poor job of providing. Along the way, they are lost. Many resources disappear or are corrupted due to inefficiency. In other words, though there is an environment of liberty, we are suffocated, because half of the time we are forced, against our will, to work in order to pay someone else. Furthermore, during the other half of the time, in which we are able to act freely and entrepreneurially, we are hounded by all kinds of administrative and bureaucratic coercion. Why does the state interfere in this way? Well, the answer is clear, as we will see in class when we study the public choice school. It is not that we are masochists or idiots. We are always sold the idea that taxes are necessary and very beneficial, and that thanks to taxes there are roads, hospitals, etc. And everyone says, well, if there were no roads, I would not be able to go from one place to another. Obviously, I must pay taxes, right? And we are told that higher education is available thanks to taxes. Well, I am a university student, and I think taxes are a very good thing, because they enable me to attend the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos. And thanks to taxes, we have health care. If I get sick, I can go to the doctor and be cured. And thanks to taxes, there are pensions. I will need one when I retire. Notice that just as we saw with socialism, very good things, remember, weasel words, are used to conceal taxes, so that people will be willing to pay them. Thus, the existence of the state is identified with a series of essential goods. Thanks to taxes, there is public order. Without taxes, we would have no police, and I might be robbed or murdered. There would be no justice. We would be plunged into chaos. It would be a free-for-all. People accept the system because of that argument, and it is a setup, as we will see. What would actually happen is that we would have much better, safer and less polluting roads, much cheaper social security, more pensions, more advanced health care, if there were no monopoly on these services, if they were not public and financed through taxes in this way. This is the area in which, as scientists, we must contribute our knowledge. We will see that this is true as we focus on each of the most significant types of interventionist measures adopted, and the conclusion we reach will be our guiding thread in this last part of the course. We will arrive at the following conclusion regarding all spheres. Interventionist measures invariably have unfortunate, regrettable results. But from whose point of view? Well, from the point of view of precisely the one who interferes, the one who backs the measures. Scientifically speaking, this is very important. I will show that each case of intervention is followed by effects which are the exact opposite of the effects intended and desired by the one who seeks and endorses the intervention. Take, for instance, the minimum wage. I support the workers, and I want them to have a higher wage, so I advocate a minimum wage. I will show that a minimum wage harms those it means to favor. That is, it causes unemployment and poverty for precisely those it is intended to benefit. We will see that the same is true with respect to social security. Note how very important the contribution of economic science is in this area. I will demonstrate in scientific terms that each interventionist measure produces effects that are the exact opposite of those intended by the one who endorses or defends the interventionist measure. The effects are harmful and damaging, but I am not referring to my own point of view, which would be of no value. It would simply be a subjective value judgment. No, I am referring to the point of view of a person who in good faith defends the interventionist measure. And this is a very important contribution economics makes to humanity. Direct government interference with consumption. What does this interventionist measure consist of? Well, it is quite simple. The command imposed by force from above says something like this: it is forbidden to drink alcohol. Do not be surprised. That was the law in certain countries for many years. Think of prohibition in the United States. Drinking alcohol was illegal. The production and distribution of alcohol were a crime, and consumption was too in certain circumstances. However, mutatis mutandis, the same law is in effect today concerning drugs other than alcohol. Drug production and distribution are illegal, and the consumption of drugs is forbidden, depending on the manner and the circumstances. The justification provided always sounds very lofty. To justify prohibition in the United States, it was argued that drinking destroys alcoholics, and that alcoholism often places families in tragic situations. Broken families, husbands who abandon their wives, children who are left in precarious circumstances. Clearly, such a harmful substance must be prohibited, and that is not to mention drugs or cocaine addicts or those who fall prey to heroin. Do we not all know someone whose life has been destroyed by drugs? Well, Papa State knows we are like children and do not know how to behave, so he forbids us to drink alcohol, or to take drugs, or to smoke. The damaging effects of smoking are quite clear. Objective studies show that smoking increases the risk of cancer. It causes lung cancer. In fact, my grandfather's brother died of lung cancer from smoking. Now smoking is banned in all public places. You have to go outside, and everybody is huddled together, smoking at building entrances, and at sidewalk cafes, and in gardens. Smoking is not permitted in restaurants, etc. Therefore, passionate, ethical considerations and goals are always superior. And the mindset is, I know better than you, and since you are not capable of doing the right thing, I will impose it on you by force, whether you like it or not. What effects does this have, strictly from the standpoint of economic theory? For now, we are going to set aside ethical considerations. That is, we will not ask to what extent a person is entitled to forcibly prohibit two adults from deciding to buy or sell a bottle of whiskey, drink it and get drunk, or to take drugs and the like. We will not go into these matters, though a lot could be said. We will analyze the effects solely from the standpoint of economic theory. Listen, unless mankind changes, as long as people keep getting bored and looking for ways to escape reality by having 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 or 30 drinks, or by shooting heroin or whatever, and this is as old as mankind itself, as long as there is a demand. If the production, distribution, and consumption of such substances are banned, a dramatic effect immediately appears. The production cost of the corresponding substances in the market, and in this case the black market, because it is illegal, skyrockets. As long as people want to keep drinking alcohol, as they did during Prohibition, they will have to pay a much higher price for it. This happens now because a dose of any drug is worth very little, but on the black market it is extremely expensive. Why? Because to the cost we must add that of producing and distributing the product outside the law. The first effect is that prices soar. The second effect is that the process of production, distribution, and consumption is criminalized. At that point, who takes care of producing and distributing the substances? The people most skilled at violating the law. That is, the process of production and distribution, up to the stage of consumption, is placed in the hands of mafias and criminals, and consumers come in contact with the world of crime. Furthermore, those criminals make a fortune. Because they are the most skilled at breaking the law, they sell the product outside the law at an exorbitant price, and that becomes a source of huge profits for them. Incidentally, it permits them to, in turn, corrupt the system, in order to somehow exercise a dominant influence and reach their goals. On top of that, they cannot turn to the regular law courts to resolve their conflicts. Listen, I want to file a suit against my mafia competitor because we agreed to split up the Salamanca district between us, and he has not kept to our agreement. So please, Your Honor, I want him to compensate me, because I am the one who distributes cocaine in this half of the district, and this guy is invading my territory. Please. Criminals do not have that option. So what do they rely on? Well, it is very simple. Gunshots and violence. And then there are people who are unable to handle drugs properly. And this is another of the most serious effects of prohibition. When people are dealing with a dangerous substance, and drugs are certainly dangerous, and I am not referring only to drugs like cocaine, heroin, and so on. These are very dangerous indeed. But alcohol is also a dangerous substance, and tobacco is as well. However, in a spontaneous order, we learn in an evolutionary way, by trial and error, how we must behave with respect to drugs. In an order of liberty, most human beings tend to learn how to handle them. In fact, in places where it is culturally acceptable to drink wine, we have learned how to drink wine. In the Mediterranean world, we know how to drink wine. We drink it with meals, and we know we can have 2 or 3 glasses of wine, and maybe a little more on weekends. And if we are at a wedding feast, then everyone knows it is a special day. There is nothing strange about this, and we have internalized it. And if you visit Northern Europe, you will find it different there too. When someone talks about alcohol there, it is as if they were talking about cocaine. Well, if I were up here pretending to sniff cocaine, everyone would start laughing. Some people would blush. What is the professor saying? Those comments people would make if I talked about cocaine here are the same comments my American students made when I brought up alcohol. In many parts of the United States, and by tradition in the English-speaking world, drinking alcohol is forbidden. It is regulated and permitted only in certain places and at certain times of day. They have not learned how to handle substances. Do you know what drinking means to young people in those areas of the United States? Drinking means taking a bottle of whiskey and downing it, glug, 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 and then another, and then falling to the floor, vomiting, and in a drunken stupor. That is drinking. They have not learned, just as we have not learned to handle cocaine, since we are prohibited from entrepreneurially experimenting with it, chewing leaves or sniffing it to find our limits. But it is not only that. It is not only that production, distribution, and consumption are criminalized. It is not only that the possibility of experimenting as consumers and learning how to handle the substance is eliminated. It is also that the poor consumer, who for other reasons, the problems of life or an inner breakdown, becomes addicted, is also criminalized. And the person goes from being ill to being a criminal. If I am ill and dependent on drugs, and I need them to live, what do? Well, I hold up a pharmacy. I rob or kill to get my fix, when that drug dose could be obtained in a free market without robbing or killing anyone, and at a price that is a tiny fraction of what is charged now on the black market. It is not only that all of society is corrupted, as we are seeing, but that it is also corrupted from the standpoint of entrepreneurial creativity. Do you know how much effort, for instance, private pharmaceutical companies could have devoted to looking for drugs which have the effect consumers want, but not the harmful effects, physical and psychological dependence, etc.? Well, that is also prohibited. Experimenting with new substances is not permitted, and can be done only secretly in a laboratory. For years, I taught classes at the law school of the Universidad Complutense in Madrid. Many of my students were police officers, because there is a program in the police force through which officers who get a law degree are promoted. They invariably said the same thing to me. "Professor, you are absolutely right. We spend most of our time fighting a losing battle when it comes to drugs. We become corrupted, and we destroy ourselves, families, drug addicts and producers, and so on, instead of devoting ourselves to defending life and property, and to keeping public order." There is a movie you have probably seen. I think it is called Traffic. You have seen it, right? Well, if not, look for it on the internet. You will see that it is not drugs, but their prohibition which destroys society. There is tremendous hypocrisy surrounding this issue, and the resulting loss, damage, and cost are also tremendous. Another movie you may have seen is called The Untouchables. Kevin Costner is Elliot Ness, a very proud graduate of the FBI Academy near Washington. He plans to save the world because he represents law and order. His first post is in Chicago in the 1930s. Prohibition is in full force. Until Elliot Ness shows up with his Untouchables and the order to enforce the law, Chicago is as quiet as the grave. Granted, there is a law against drinking alcohol, but everybody drinks alcohol on the weekends. People simply know where to go. There are places in dark alleys, and people knock, and someone inside takes a good look at them before letting them in. Inside there is a big party going on. There is an orchestra, and people are dancing the Charleston. Everybody is drinking and happy, and everybody is there. The mayor, civil servants, police officers, entrepreneurs, the bishop, everybody. They have a great time. Of course, all of this requires barrels of alcohol. Where do they come from, since alcohol is prohibited? Well, since the Great Lakes are on the border with Canada, the barrels are smuggled in. They are smuggled in, and somebody has to do the smuggling. The mobsters take care of it. Al Capone and the different families, who make an enormous amount of money and know how to bribe the police. The mobsters pay the poor police, and all they have to do is look the other way, right when the barrels are passing. The barrels go by, and once they have all passed, the officers can look again. Everyone is peaceful. Some people earn more money, others have fun, and there is no problem. The problem arises, dear students, when Elliot Ness, FBI agent, arrives and wants to impose the law. If you watch the movie, you will see that at that point the death toll begins to soar. The FBI cavalry even ends up attacking a convoy of cars and trucks smuggling alcohol, and a huge number of people die. At the end, Al Capone is arrested, but not for what you would expect. A disloyal employee simply reports that the mobster does not pay taxes. He is put in prison, and that is how the movie ends. Elliot Ness, FBI, is very happy after testifying. He listens with great satisfaction to the court ruling that sentences Al Capone to prison for tax evasion. And this comes after hundreds of deaths in preceding years due to gunfights and all sorts of violence. Well, as Mr. Ness is leaving the courthouse, and the movie shows this very well, he is smoking a cigarette. Smoking had not yet been prohibited, and a child approaches, yelling, "Extra! Extra! Read all about it!" One of those children who used to sell newspapers for a couple of cents. "Extra! Extra!" Ness buys a paper, and he reads the huge headline. Prohibition has been repealed. What an intelligent measure! Why do they not take similar ones today to do away with all the laws still in force prohibiting other drugs? It would be wonderful. Then the child says, Mr. Ness, read the news. Prohibition has been repealed. What are you going to do now? And Kevin Costner, Elliot Ness, says, now I'm going to go have a glass of whiskey. What a bastard! After everything he has done, now he goes and has a glass of whiskey. If instead of pursuing Al Capone, they had asked this guy to go gas Jews, for instance, his efficiency would have been extraordinary. Well, the minute it was declared that prohibition was abolished, the mobsters' main source of profit disappeared. Do you know who financed the lobby to maintain prohibition? Who benefited from prohibition? Al Capone and the mobsters. Who do you think has the greatest interest in maintaining the prohibition of drugs nowadays? The mafias. The moment drug production, distribution and consumption are liberalized, the mafia's entire source of profit will disappear. Drugs would be purchased at pharmacies. There would be opium smokers, like there were in the United States until 1910. It was a socially accepted practice, and there was no problem. And if someone had become addicted to the drug and was consistently out of it, that person was ill and needed a different kind of treatment. But just as there were bars and cafes, there were opium dens, and there was no problem. Nor was anyone pursued by the law. Nor did girls have to prostitute themselves to get their drug fix, like we see in traffic. Nor was an entire society destroyed due to the forcible imposition of an absurd law. Notice how direct interference with consumption produces effects that are the exact opposite of those desired. A few years ago, at the beginning of this century, I gave a seminar at the Summer University of Santander on this topic, the liberalization of drugs. I invited the most important judges in the criminal division of the Supreme Court. With great satisfaction, I heard from their own lips that I was quite right, and they are the ones in charge of making rulings. Think about that. If my police officer students felt they were spending their lives destroying society by fighting drugs, and the Supreme Court judges who attended the seminar recognized the serious harm being done, then the conclusion is very clear. To solve the whole drug problem, we need only liberalize drugs in all spheres. That is the main conclusion we reach based on the economic analysis of this first interventionist measure. Thank you very much.